It's March 19th, 1662, and another remarkable event is about to be uncovered by Ariel, Rebecca, and Ali, the Retrospectors.
Blaise Pascal, the 17th century French mathematician, physicist, inventor, and philosopher, had another feather in his cap that never quite made it to the top of his CV, inventor of the public bus, because it was today in history in 1662 that the polymath genius oversaw the first full day of service of his horse-drawn public omnibuses in Paris.
Yeah, one of Pascal's hobbies was that he was an inventor. At the age of 18, he invented the first mechanical calculator, although it was too cumbersome for commercial use. But he had also invented several prototypes of vehicles, including a wheelbarrow and a wheeled sedan chair. So he was interested in transport generally. And he managed to pitch this idea of a public bus, although they weren't calling it that. They were calling it the five-sou carriage. But he managed to pitch this idea to several aristocrats, kind of like 1600s Dragon's Den, and they were willing to sponsor it.
Love the idea of Louis XIV on the Dragon's Den panel.
Yeah, he was the only dragon. They petitioned him for the right to create what they called, and of course they had to spell it out because it wasn't a thing, carriages which would always make the same journeys and would always leave at scheduled times without waiting to be filled up, even empty, without the people that enjoyed the commodity having to pay for the empty seats. So he was saying, look, this is how it's going to work. And the city council, the Parlement of Paris, took the step of banning massive sections of society who were seen as undesirable from actually using it, including labourers, soldiers and pages. And after a few trial weeks while the kinks were straightened out, because this is pre-Haussmann Paris, so it's this real rabbit warren of medieval streets, and actually just getting a large wheeled vehicle down them was no easy task, the service finally got underway.
Yeah, and I mean, yes, it's true. They didn't allow the working class on them. But when you think what the options were that were available in Paris pre this day to get around the city, I mean, there was walk, obviously, or be on horseback yourself. But otherwise, you had to be wealthy to be able to have your own carriage. There'd just been the emergence of these things known as fiacres, which were kind of carriage for hire businesses for the middle class. So they could pretend to be rich, but actually they didn't really own the carriage. They were just paying for the journey. But now here was something for the lower middle class as well. You know, you could be a professional person going about Paris, as I say, not the working class, but nonetheless, a professional person going around Paris who didn't have enough money to afford to hire your own carriage, but you could get from A to B without having to walk or be on a horse. And that did massively open up opportunities for people to get around the city quickly and efficiently, and also through the different classes as well, because even though rich people could afford their own carriages, sometimes they'd get on these buses, you know, because it was cheaper and they thought it was more efficient. And that meant different stratas of society socialising with each other, as we see on public transport now. I mean, this was all there in 1662, and a bit like that calculator he invented that you mentioned, it was kind of 200 years ahead of its time, really, because he didn't just sort of invent the bus by doing this. This was essentially the invention of fixed route public transport long before trains. You know, so it's not just the first bus, it's kind of in effect the first tram or train in conception as well.
Yeah, and I think it is worth accordingly thinking about what this thing actually looked like, because they were these big, large, rectangular, covered carriages. They could carry about 8 to 10 people inside. There was an additional space of benches outside for a few more people. Windows were kind of open or covered with canvas to allow ventilation. But that very idea, is exactly as you're saying, Ollie, of like a shared, scheduled transport, that was hugely revolutionary. And certain issues had to be resolved. Like, how do you get people into and out of this thing in a way that isn't going to inconvenience other people? But I think just that opportunity of being in the presence of other people in a transportational setting where previously you wouldn't have been around anyone that you didn't know really would have been entirely revolutionary.
Yeah, and it was a brilliant scheme. You know, the first line ran from Porte Saint-Antoine, one of the original entrances to the city, not far from Notre Dame, across the Seine to the Luxembourg Palace. And over the next 4 months, 4 other lines were introduced, 3 of them kind of lines through the city. But line 4 was like a proto-circle line. It went around the city and it was divided into fare zones as well. So you would pay for the percentage of the circle, if you like, that you were travelling. And brilliantly, there were also interchange stops along the way, like you'd get in a modern metro system. But the audience just wasn't quite there. One reason was the expense. From what I can work out, an unskilled workman in Paris might earn around 250 livres per year, meaning they'd have 13 or 14 sous per day to live on. So a single trip on this bus would represent more than a third of their day's wage. So this was too much to be a regular trip, because obviously, a hypothetical workman always had to pay for everything else. But it was affordable enough to be a novelty for the lower middle class family. And that ended up being the primary market. In fact, Pascal's sister, Gilberte, said that the first day of operation was this big success. And she made a point of noting that there were women among the passengers, which was obviously considered quite surprising. So you did have this big audience of people that wanted to have the novelty of riding around on this new thing, but it wasn't a viable business model, especially because every 8-person coach was serviced by both a driver but also a footman. And so, there was a large expense really for a relatively small amount of passengers per trip. And also the problem was, what this really needed was the Industrial Revolution to create a huge working class population that had been ghettoized into slums. Because in the 1660s, most poor people and lower middle class people in the city lived near their place of work. It was even common to live with your employers. And so they didn't really have cause to leave their local area. There was no sense of commuting as we know it today. A lot of people just lived in their district of Paris and they weren't traveling into the centre to go to their office job. They didn't have any of these things yet.
Yeah, so over time it sort of withered away, partly because, the whole point of it was, again, as with a modern transport network, very insightful and ahead of its time, you wouldn't have to wait more than 15 minutes for a bus. So you didn't need to worry about the schedule. You could stand at a bus stop and the horse would turn up within 15 minutes and you'd be able to get on. But of course, that only works if there's enough demand to justify that level of service. But you do wonder if Blaise Pascal had survived, whether he might have solved that issue, because he was obviously such a switched on and clever kind of polymath. I mean, proper Renaissance man, as we've been saying, maths, physics, philosophy, theology. He was in his 30s at this point. He'd been sick for most of his life. He knew he was dying. It's quite interesting that this was his final project.
Yeah, and that meant that not only did Blaise Pascal not live to see buses become a big feature of the day-to-day lives of people around the world, but also just the whole world didn't get to see it. But one of the people who pioneered buses once they stuck was a chap called Stanislas Baudry, and he launched an early horse-drawn service in Nantes in 1823. One popular legend claims that the reason for the word omnibus was that one of the very first stops on this very first service was in front of a hat shop that was owned by a man named Omne, or Omnes, and the sign supposedly read Omnes Omnibus, as in like all for all. He had hats for everybody, and that sign near the takeoff point of this new service became associated with buses. I think that is probably entirely fictional, because omnibus really was a word that meant in Latin for all, and that was what this was meant to be.
Yeah, and what had changed in the intervening time since the failure of Pascal's service was not only did you now have a much larger urbanized population who were commuting to their jobs, but you also had the rise of a leisure economy too. And lots of European cities had been like Paris, they'd started as medieval settlements, they'd grown organically, they were quite haphazard. But by this time in the 1800s, they were starting to become more formalized and more siloed into different kinds of districts. And so this was a point where not only did you have finally a large enough group of people who could use this service, but you also had places to go. In the 1600s, people weren't, the average lower middle class or working class person wasn't going to the theatre or going to a restaurant. That wouldn't have been something they would even have conceived of doing. Now you suddenly had, not only do you need people to use the service, you also have to have places to go.
Yeah, well, again, the fact that it's a service for all, I think is seen in the numbering system for buses, because not everyone could read. If it just had a sign saying where it was going, you wouldn't know where it was going. But if you remember, I need to get the 111, that's, speaks to the fact that right from the beginning, as we're saying with Pascal, the idea of the 5-penny carriage, okay, maybe the fare was slightly overblown for the target audience, but putting the fare into the service's name is the real mission statement here, isn't it? It is for all, it is for everybody, that's the concept. And as you say, it really takes off in the Victorian era, particularly in Victorian London, where you had the first omnibus out of all of these global cities that actually started allowing passengers to hail it along the route and jump on and off. So they didn't just have to wait at bus stops, which Londoners, of course, remained committed to in concept right the way through the 20th century, even when it got to the point where it was clearly dangerous to have buses that people could jump on and off at because there were cars travelling at 30 miles an hour around them. And so when they redesigned the Route Master in London, there was a lot of controversy that the back of the bus was only sometimes going to be open so that you could fling yourself out onto the street. But that all comes back to the popularity of the omnibus in this era, and also the origin of the double-decker, which we still have in London now, which came from offering cheaper seats on the roof. So, you'd have the dignified ladies downstairs, and then people who were just jumping on and off to go a few stops would pay less to sit on the roof.
I think they should do that in reverse now. People would definitely pay more to sit at the front, at the top, and drive the bus.
Yeah, I love that space.
Tomorrow.
Killed 25 million people around the world just in this first burst.
Ditch the ads and get a Sunday episode when you join Club Retrospectors. Patreon.com/retrospectors.